Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
If you enjoy our show and you find our research interesting, please leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does go a long way in helping us out. You can find more about us and the research that we do by heading over to Instagram and searching our name. As always, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You will no doubt be familiar with the case that we are going to talk about tonight. Everyone and their mother has heard of this case, and many others have invested their time to do some cursory research into the subject. You may have watched some of the well-known documentaries about this case, West of Memphis by director Amy Berg, or the Paradise Lost trilogy of documentaries directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. What is less likely, however, unless you have decided to take a deep dive into this case yourself, is the likelihood that you will be aware of all the evidence and circumstance that surround this very controversial series of events. Not just the murders, though very controversial in themselves, but the subsequent trial and the following 25 years of drama and ongoing developments. I'm not approaching this subject with hubris and assuming that this case is mine, that I am the first to venture into the details, or that I have dug up a gold mine of brand new information. No, far from it. I'm simply sharing a comprehensive and unbiased view of one of the most polarizing cases in the United States criminal history. I hope that you will join me on this journey. It's one of our more detailed and lengthy episodes, shall we say, but one we think has a huge payoff and is worth the journey. With that said, I'm going to attempt to synthesize this case and its information into the most helpful and thorough form that I possibly can. Now, before we start to get into things, a little housekeeping on my part. This will be the last series of episodes under the Dead Souls Social Club banner. Don't worry, we aren't going anywhere. We will be relaunching, finally, in May. The reason that we chose May is that we think this series will take around 4 episodes to play out, and we intend to drop 1 episode weekly until it's complete. We'll then relaunch under our new style and title. I'll put more information on our Instagram soon, so keep your eye out for that. Finally, and before we begin, as is my proclivity for transparency and honesty, I will make absolute clear that whilst I have my own thoughts and feelings in regards to this case, my intention is to simply share facts and data only. By now, I'd like to think that those of you who listen regularly know that my aim is to share the information and allow you to form your own opinions based on that information. This series of episodes is no different. What I have sought to do is source everything presented here either from Callahan or other such reliable data resources regarding the case. Where I do share a limited opinion on small aspects of the case and information that I present, I will make it clear that I am doing so and provide forewarning. So, this is a huge and complicated case with vast amounts of documents and information to wade through. I'm going to do my very best to consolidate it to a more manageable narrative. Even with that in mind, this is looking like it could possibly be our biggest and most in-depth series ever. Brace yourself, Effie. But with that in mind, let's dive into one of the most enduring murder mysteries of the 1990s. Postscript, I'd like to give a special and eternal thanks to Grace Blackmore for additional research, Sunny Morgan for legal translation and support, and of course Mark W. Butler for data and further additional research. The size of this thing was way beyond just me alone. This is The Case of the West Memphis 3, Part 1. Case Overview. For those of you who are totally new to this case, the West Memphis 3 refers to the now infamous murders of Chris Byers, Stevie Branch, and Michael Moore, 3 8-year-old boys from West Memphis, Arkansas. The 3 victims, however, aren't the so-called West Memphis 3 that the case is named after. 3 local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, who were eventually tried and convicted of the crimes in 1994, are the three referred to here as the West Memphis Three, in a subtle example of the perpetrators receiving more press than the victims. Now, this case has proven to be contentious to say the very least. There are a huge amount of supporters who believe in the innocence of the three men who were convicted, including several celebrities such as Johnny Depp and Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, and of course the Dixie Chicks, or the Chicks as they are now known. They firmly believe, along with millions of other people, that the three convicted of the crime here are in fact wrongfully convicted, a product of the infamous satanic panic. A quick search on Google, or spending some time on Reddit, will turn up an equal amount of people who steadfastly believe that the three men convicted are absolutely guilty of the crimes. This case has split those who followed it for years. Their convictions, you can argue, seem to matter a lot less now, because in 2011, the three convicted teenagers, now men, were offered what is called an Alford plea, which they accepted and were subsequently released from prison, although their convictions will remain on their records. This plea essentially allowed them to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them and release them under time served, which equated to 18 years for each of them in this case. Throw in some sketchy police work, a mysterious man wandering into a fast food restaurant covered in blood at the time of the murders, crazy and eccentric characters and strange behaviours, a trial laced with Satan and tales of cults with blackened faces at the height of the satanic panic, and you have a complex, confusing behemoth of a criminal case. Stevie, Chris and Michael. With all of the chaos, controversy and just plain weirdness of this case, it can be easy to forget that at the heart of it all were three children who were brutally murdered on May the 5th, 1993. Those who knew the three young victims described them as happy youngsters who were best friends and did everything together. They attended Weaver Elementary School and were all in the same second grade class. Cheeky, energetic and playful, average 8-year-old boys. They loved playing outside and going on mini adventures in their neighbourhood and the surrounding fields, rivers and woods, and, more than anything, being in the Cub Scouts, where they each had achieved the rank of Wolf. Chris Byers was a bundle of energy. He was diagnosed with ADHD and was always switched on, so to speak. Meanwhile, Stevie Branch was young for his age and extremely innocent. He still believed in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and he loved to sing. His mom would liken him to Bart Simpson due to his spiky blonde hair and cheeky sense of humour. Michael Moore was the most avid lover of the outdoors of the three. He wore his Cub Scout uniform almost every day and liked to bring various odds and ends that he found on his outdoor adventures to school to show his friends and teachers. All three children were tragically found dead in a drainage ditch on May the 6th, 1993, after being reported missing the day before during the evening of May 5th. The basic details of the disappearance. So, as I mentioned, on May the 5th, 1993, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers would be reported missing. The first police report was made by Christopher Byers' father, John Mark Byers, at around 7 p.m. The boys had been out playing together since around 3:30 p.m, with Stevie and Michael initially heading out to play on their bicycles within their neighbourhood, and with Christopher joining them shortly afterward. The boys were last seen together by three neighbours, who later provided signed affidavits where they stated they had seen the boys playing together at approximately 6:30 p.m. Additionally, the same witnesses stated that they saw Terry Hobbs, who was the stepfather of Stevie Branch, calling the children to come home at around the same time. He appeared to be walking the neighbourhood streets looking for the boys. Now, before we go any further, be sure to pay close attention to every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it may appear, as all is not what it seems in this case, and everything holds water in some way, shape or form. The initial police search that was made that night was very limited. At this time in Arkansas, it was police policy not to conduct any searches for missing persons unless 24 hours had passed. although, due to the boys' ages, some exception to that rule was given. Some. Friends and neighbours conducted their own search that evening too, which actually included a visit to the location where the bodies would later be found. More on that later. The police stepped up their efforts the following morning, with a more thorough search beginning at around 8 a.m. on May 6th. This second search included the Crittenden County Search and Rescue Team and a significant increase in manpower. The searchers canvassed all of West Memphis, though focused primarily on the area known as Robin Hood Hills and the surrounding neighbourhoods, where the boys were last reported as being sighted. The Robin Hood Hills was a small wood with a river running through it, situated on the edge of the suburban neighbourhood the boys lived, and with a commercial estate and truck stop on the other side. It's difficult to convey the size and locations involved in this case, so I would suggest looking up a map of the area while you listen to this, just to gain a visual in your mind. There are tons of resources online for this to support your visualization, but I have also added a map and some other resources to our Instagram account, which you can take a look at. You can find it over on Instagram.com/dead_souls_podcast. Despite a shoulder-to-shoulder search of the Robin Hood Hills by a human chain, searchers found no sign of the missing boys there on the morning of May 6th. At around 1:45 p.m, juvenile parole officer Steve Jones spotted a boy's black shoe floating in a muddy creek that flowed into a drainage canal within the Robin Hood Hills woods. A closer look at the drainage ditch revealed the bodies of the 3 boys, all submerged in the 2-foot deep water. The boys had been stripped naked and hog-tied with their own shoelaces. Their right ankles had been tied to their right wrists behind their backs, and the same with their left ankles and wrists too. Their clothing would be discovered shortly after their bodies, and were also found within the creek. They had been twisted around sticks and then thrust into the muddy creek bed, a very unique practice, police thought. The clothing had been turned inside out. It's worth noting that 2 pairs of the boys' underwear were never found. The body of Christopher Byers had jagged lacerations to various parts of his body, and his scrotum and penis had been removed. Stevie Branch had severe lacerations covering the right-hand side of his face, and both ears were torn. The autopsies by forensic pathologist Frank J. Peretti indicated that Christopher Byers had died of multiple injuries, while Michael Moore and Stevie Branch had died of multiple injuries and drowning, which was identified due to water being present in the boys' lungs. Initially, the police investigators suspected that the boys had likely been raped. However, this was later ruled out following examinations of the bodies during autopsy. There were, however, trace amounts of semen DNA found on 1 pair of trousers that were recovered from the scene. Prosecution experts claimed that Christopher Byers' wounds were the result of a serrated knife attack and that he had been purposely castrated by the murderer. Defense experts claimed that the injuries were most likely the result of post-mortem animal predation, however. The police believed the boys were assaulted and killed at the location where they were found. Some critics and independent investigators have argued that the assault, at least, was unlikely to have occurred at the creek, and that it was merely the location where the bodies were dumped. Christopher Byers was the only victim with drugs in his system. Due to his ADHD condition, he was prescribed Ritalin in January 1993 as part of his treatment. The initial autopsy report describes the drug specifically as carbamazepine, and the dosage was at a subtherapeutic level. Christopher's father said that he may have not taken his prescription on that day that he disappeared. He was, quote, often forgetful like that, unquote. Now, like everything else in this case, things are not what they initially may seem. Popular understanding of the case is that the children rode their bicycles to Robin Hood Hills, or at least Stevie and Michael did. Christopher was seen by witnesses on the back of Michael Moore's bike. The killer, or killers, then murdered the boys in the woods. Actual testimony paints a very different story though. On the day of May 5th, the three children were bicycling all over their neighborhood after school. Stevie Branch wore a white t-shirt and blue jeans, while Chris Byers was wearing a long-sleeved white shirt. He had dark shoes on and he was carrying a skateboard instead of a bike. Michael, as we know, was wearing his beloved Boy Scout uniform, complete with a hat and blue trousers. Stevie's bike was red and black, while Michael's was a light green colour. The police recovered the bicycles after the crime, and there is conflicting accounts in regards to the skateboard. John Mark Byers claimed that the skateboard was found near Michael Moore's house during the trial. However, Chris Byers' older brother Ryan told the jury that the skateboard they found was one that he had never seen before. There was no skateboard ever admitted into evidence. There is also an extremely wide gap between sightings of the three boys. They were placed in multiple different locations between 5 p.m. to 6:45 p.m., sighted by both family and neighbours in the area. Stevie Branch. Pam Hobbs, the mother of Stevie, would not be informed of her son's disappearance until 9:25 p.m. on the night he vanished. She had been in work, a restaurant named Catfish Island, where she was a waitress, with her shift starting at 5 p.m. In a 2007 interview, she said that she saw Stevie last at 3:30 p.m. when he headed out to play with Michael Moore. The two boys left on their bikes. Initially, Pam was apprehensive to let him go out, as she liked her children to be home when she went to work, so she had asked him to be home by 4:30 p.m. She did not see him again for the rest of the evening. In a 2007 interview, Terry Hobbs, Stevie's stepfather, claimed that he did not see Stevie at all that evening. Christopher Byers. Ryan Clark, Chris's older brother, testified that he did not see Chris before he left their house to be a witness in a court case at 4 p.m. that day. In 2007, Pam Hobbs said in her interview that Chris came over around 3:30 and asked to play with Stevie, but Stevie had just left with Michael on their bikes. Pam Hobbs stated that her other child, daughter Amanda, 4 years Stevie's junior, was watching a television show called Muppet Babies at the time. As Chris had missed his two friends, he asked if he could come in and watch the cartoon with Amanda, to which Pam agreed. Chris stayed until 4 p.m. when the cartoon finished. John Mark Byers saw Christopher shortly after 5:20 p.m. when he left to pick up his other son Ryan from court. Byers said that Chris was skateboarding on the street and that he beat him with a belt buckle as a punishment because Chris was riding in the middle of the road and not looking where he was going. After the beating, Byers told Christopher to clean up the carport area outside their house as punishment. Melissa Byers, his mother, last saw Christopher in the carport at 5:30 p.m. after arriving home from work. Michael Moore. Pam Hobbs saw Michael leave her house with Stevie on their bikes at 3:30 p.m. His mother, Dana Moore, saw him last at 6 p.m. heading towards Robin Hood Hills. She claimed in a witness statement to have seen all three of the boys, with Christopher climbing on the back of Michael's bike. Michael's sister Dawn, who was a year older than Michael, raced after Michael trying to bring him back but did not catch up to the three boys. She told the police that she had seen 3 teenagers, 1 white male and 2 black males, exit in the woods around this time. They apparently tried to sell drugs to her before going on their way. Other sightings. 3 non-family members from the neighbourhood were called to testify at trial: Narlene Hollingsworth, Brian Woody, and Deborah Otinga. Otinga gave a statement to the police at the end of June 1993, claiming to have seen the children in front of her yard at 5:30 p.m. on the day that they disappeared. Though, she adds, they had left before she backed out of her driveway at 6 p.m, as she was on her way to dinner with friends. During the trial, she reiterated that 2 of the boys, one on a bicycle, were in front of her driveway at 6 p.m. She remembered them because she had to wait in her truck to leave for her appointment. One of the children she could identify was Christopher Byers. Brian Woody was another key witness, and he placed the kids in Robin Hood Woods sometime between 6:30 and 6:45 p.m. His neighbours backed him up, and they also said that they observed the three boys heading towards Robin Hood Hills around 6:30 p.m. They would change the number to 4 boys in a statement given later in September of 1993, however. Woody's sighting has several problems with it. For one, he claims to have seen 4 children. But the other somewhat bigger issue is that he had limited time to actually see the victims due to crossing at an intersection at more than 40 miles per hour when he is said to have seen the boys. As one impartial case observer put it at the time of the trial, quote, "He would only have been able to see the children when he was crossing the intersection of 14th and Goodwin. Travelling at 40 to 40 miles per hour, his car would move 59 to 66 feet in 1 second. Heading to 1823 Goodwin, he would have had to have seen the kids out of his driver's side window for a maximum of less than 1 second, and it would only be the maximum amount of time if for some reason he was speeding down Goodwin looking out of his side window." Unquote. Woody was not able to verify any of the victims by name, and said he thought the kids may have been the victims because one sported a similar spiky hairstyle to Stevie Branch. This comment was attacked profusely by the defense team at trial. The following is a brief excerpt of the exchange between Brian Woody and George Wadley, who was one of the defense attorneys for Jason Baldwin, one of the 3 teenagers on trial for the murders. Here is the transcript.
George Wadley. On any given day, you recognized the one boy that had a spiked hair, is that correct? Brian Woody. Yes. Wadley. And I believe you testified that your son, Woody. Yes. Wadley. Wore that hairstyle? Woody. Well, he's a lot younger, but it just sticks up on its own. Wadley. During that time, were there a lot of children that you saw out there that wore that type of hair? Woody. Yeah, there's Wadley. Mr. Woody, how long did you have a chance to observe these 4 boys, Woody? About 5 seconds, Wadley. 5 seconds? Woody. Yeah, I was doing about 45 miles per hour, I'm not gonna lie. Wadley. So you looked at them for about 5 seconds?
Narlene Hollingsworth, an important figure in this case, also gave a statement that claims that she saw the victims, something that I will analyse later in the Hollingworth section of the series. In addition to the ones that testified at trial, other witnesses gave statements and identified the boys by name during door-to-door questioning by the police in the week after the bodies were discovered. One person saw Stevie Branch and Michael Moore on their bikes at 6 p.m, but did not see Christopher Byers with them. Another witness, Kim Williams, said that she was with the boys at this time, although very briefly. Kim Williams claimed to have seen Stevie Branch and Michael Moore then go into Robin Hood Hills, although about a quarter mile away from where the crime scene was and in a different area than the first witness had spotted them. Kim Williams claimed that this was sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m. Williams also said that Stevie Branch and Michael Moore left their bicycles on Goodwin Avenue. She also claims she saw 3 teenagers around the woods area, 2 black males and 1 white male, which echoes what Dawn Moore said in her statement. 2 members of the same family saw Stevie Branch and Michael Moore in a slightly different place at 6 p.m, heading towards the Mayfair Apartments on Cat Street, which is near the crime scene. They told the police that the victims were carrying green backpacks, none of which were found at the crime scene. Another witness placed Christopher Byers well away from the woods at 7 p.m, describing him as bicycling with a blonde kid. This witness knew Christopher Byers, but did get the descriptions of the bicycles wrong. A friend of Christopher's claimed that he stopped by after getting whipped by his father, but did not specify the time. The only witness that saw the 3 children on the north and east of the Pipe Bridge, near where the interstate crosses the bayou, was Cynthia Rico. The pipe bridge was a group of 3 large pipes that crossed the river that separated the neighborhood from the Robin Hood Hills woods. It was in the river next to the pipe bridge where the boys' bicycles were found by police on May 6th. Cynthia Rico saw the boys sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m. This conflicted with other witness statements, but she did know there were only 2 bikes and described them both accurately. This is all pretty confusing. What we basically have is no one credible, with the exception of possibly Cynthia Rico, as really being able to place the boys in the Robin Hood Hills woods. It's also common knowledge that the police team investigating the crimes in the week after the bodies were discovered made a half-assed attempt at the door-to-door questioning of potential witnesses. They only visited 2/3 of properties in the vicinity and failed to return if no one answered when they initially knocked. At most, we have testimony that the boys appeared to be heading towards the Robin Hood Hills, being spotted either on Cat Street towards the crime scene or in the direction of Robin Hood Hills on Goodwin Avenue, distinctly different locations. What's also interesting is most of the witnesses actually placed Christopher away from the other 2 boys at the crucial 6 o'clock hour. 6 p.m. is generally accepted to be the times that the boys went missing. This includes Christopher's own father, who stated that he saw Christopher playing on the street alone a couple of houses away, and that his own mother who placed him in the carport at around 5:30 p.m. The credibility of the witness who saw Christopher at 7 p.m. is considered questionable given a number of details that they had incorrect. But with that said, it's bolstered by 4 fairly believable witnesses who all saw Stevie and Michael together at roughly the same time and place. Eyewitnesses, man, it's such a struggle to sift through the noise and identify the truth or accuracy. The time of death. Well, in a nutshell, no one really knows. The general agreement in recent years from a wide array of independent researchers is that the boys were killed sometime between 6 and 9 p.m., a time that was very convenient for the prosecution. It was also a time that proved to be very hard for multiple residents of West Memphis to find alibis for. The medical examiner, Frank Peretti, originally testified that the time of death occurred from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. in the morning. The prosecution told the judge that he had sprung this on them without telling them beforehand. They brought another witness to disprove Peretti's original estimate, named Dr. Duke Jennings, who was a local pathologist. Jennings alleged that Peretti had only taken into account the lividity of the bodies, citing other factors like temperature, bleeding, and position. Some of Jennings' findings are hotly disputed by credible research groups, such as JivePuppy.com, which claim that Peretti did in fact take into account temperature and actually consulted with other experts. However, another expert consulting with Ron Lax, named Chris Sperry, estimated the time of death to be at around roughly 8:30 p.m. on May 5th, and also said he believed Peretti did not take into account the temperature. Guessing the time of death is an extremely subjective piece of science, and the original medical examiner admitted that he wasn't all that sure in all reality. It seems most probable that the boys were indeed murdered in the evening hours, but the timeline would have to be pretty tight since the boys' last whereabouts happened to be at roughly 6:30 p.m, and searchers helping the parents began to flood the woods sometime at around 8 to 9 p.m. that night. The crime scene. There are many photographs of the crime scene online. Police took video and many detailed photographs and released them all to the public. They are pretty shocking, and I advise you to approach them with extreme caution. They don't hold back, and remember, the victims are children. The original Paradise Lost documentary actually opens with some clips of the crime scene video the police recorded, albeit with slight blurring to hide the victims' faces. It doesn't censor much else though, surprisingly. On the west side of the Robin Hood Hills woods is the Blue Beacon truck wash. It's very well lit at night and stocked 24/7 with 2 employees. A little further to the west is the 76 truck stop. No one who worked at the truck wash or 76 truck stop reported anything unusual there that evening when they were interviewed as a group by police. To the east is a field, and further east are more woods, which are also part of the Robin Hood Hills area. North of the crime scene is a service road which runs parallel to the interstate. To get to the crime scene, the children probably would have had to have crossed the previously mentioned pipe bridge over the bayou or river water. The pipe bridge is wide enough for two people to stand side by side on it and walk upright comfortably. As I previously mentioned, the bicycles were found in the bayou next to the pipe bridge. The pipe bridge connects the Robin Hood Hills woods to the Mayfair apartment complex on the other side. This was a popular spot for children to play, and for parents to forbid their children from entering. The local kids thought of it as an adventure spot, and the prosecution referred to it as a child's paradise. Christopher Byers often hid his muddy shoes from his mother and denied ever going there. Though numerous neighborhood kids testified to having played in Robin Hood Hills, all while saying that they didn't do it anymore, of course. One witness claimed that they never saw any adults in the area at all. There were numerous strange sightings of teenagers loitering in the woods both prior to and at the time of the murders. We will discuss this in more detail later. There were multiple trails to the crime location in addition to across the pipe. Two of them are on the side of the Blue Beacon truck wash, with one going directly from the 76 truck stop. It is also possible to access the crime location from the field to the east. There are no trails directly from the interstate or the service road, although there is one near it. The West Memphis Police Department found the boys in a drainage ditch, a kind of off-stream or creek that ran off the main bayou or river located in the Robin Hood Hills woods. The ditch was around 2 feet deep at the time of the children's bodies being discovered. It was a slow-moving, tepid, murky water stream. I say was, as a lot has changed on the land since the crimes of 1993, and the location looks completely different now, although there are a few small identifiable markers that remain, like the pipe bridge and the Blue Beacon truck wash. The kids were all tied right ankle to right wrist and left ankle to left wrist, instead of the more traditional hog tie. It's worth noting that this method would have still given the boys freedom to move and struggle free. So, the way they were tied was obviously not meant as a restraint. Michael Moore's body was found 27 feet north of Stevie Branch and Christopher Byers' bodies, which were 5 feet apart. This may indicate that if the boys were in fact murdered at the scene, that Michael had attempted to run away after witnessing something that affected Stevie and Christopher first. One contentious part of the crime scene was the so-called slicked-off creek bank, right in front of where Michael Moore's body was found. The prosecution alleged it was meticulously cleaned up. They pointed out scuff marks, swirl patterns, and the absence of any leaves only in this specific area. The defense team claimed that the pictures were too dark to see this level of detail, however. The evidence. Okay, so here is where the crime starts to get weird. In addition to finding the boys' bodies, the West Memphis Police Department also retrieved clothing jammed down into the creek bed with sticks. Sticks at the crime scene, including one with a piece of a shirt on it, were not delivered into evidence until 2 months later. Some strange observations were made. 5 socks and 2 pairs of underwear were missing. The police did manage to locate all 3 of the boys' trousers, 2 of which were inside out and buttoned up, having been rebuttoned after their removal. A blue and yellow Cub Scout cap was found, but this was attributed to belonging to Michael Moore. However, his hat was different colours. His was blue and orange, and his parents didn't recognise the one that was found at the scene. Neither Stevie or Christopher were wearing a hat that day. The shirts found also did not match what the boys were supposed to be wearing. Both Christopher and Stevie were wearing white long-sleeved shirts that day, while one shirt recovered had surfboard designs and another had black and white polka dots. Michael's Cub Scout shirt was the only shirt found at the crime scene that matched what he was wearing. The clothes were devoid of blood and showed little sign of struggle or damage, meaning that the boys either undressed themselves or were stripped down slowly and carefully by the killers before they were attacked and tied. One of the victims' trousers had a stain on them. It was suspected to be semen. Don't forget, the boys were 8 years old when they were murdered. Unfortunately, in 1993, there was no way to know for sure what sort of DNA was on the trousers, since the water and mud had corroded the sample. If it was indeed semen, this matches up with one of Jesse Miss Kelly's later confessions, in which he claimed that Damien Eccles had jacked off and wiped it on the boys' trousers. But I don't want to get ahead of myself just yet and talk about the suspected killers. Michael Moore was said to be clutching the fibres of a blanket in his hand. Why or where that blanket came from has never been determined, though it was briefly brought up during the trial. Other pieces of evidence found at the crime scene, but not connected to the crime itself, were a plastic pill bottle with cigarette butts, a bag with clothing and 2 razors, a cotton rope, and knives that were not found in the immediate crime scene but were located in the same ditch as the victims' bodies. A screwdriver was also found jammed into the mud, sticking straight up near to the clothes. Various other pieces of garbage were also found, but it was determined that they were disposed of prior to the murder taking place. Hairs and fibres were also found at the crime scene, something I'll go into greater detail about later. Were the children killed at the crime scene? Well, this was an early debate among the prosecution and the defense teams. If they were not killed at the crime scene, then the culpability of the 3 teenagers was seriously suspect, as none of the convicted had access to cars or any other form of transport. Moving 3 children's bodies is no simple task. Further, not one trace of blood was found at the crime scene, but luminol tests were taken. Now, for those unaware, luminol is used in forensic testing and science. Luminol is a chemical that exhibits chemical luminescence with a blue glow when mixed with an appropriate oxidizing agent. It can be a great help to police, though it's not always reliable. According to the report, the luminol findings proved that the boys had been murdered where their bodies were found. As mentioned, luminol can be very unreliable, and this is due to lighting up the presence of other properties besides blood, like iron and feces. A different luminol test on the soil turned up as inconclusive. The luminol was not allowed into evidence at trial due to the test being uncorroborated in this particular investigation. The motive for bringing the boys to the crime scene makes little sense, since the person would run a great risk of being seen when transporting them. 2 of the 3 boys were officially determined to have drowned to death, though the medical examiner claimed that the head wounds sustained were enough to kill them alone as well. It's likely the bodies were not put into the creek to drown them, but to hide them. The water in the boys' lungs also means that they must have been submerged in the water quickly after sustaining the head wounds. The last sightings placed the victims either entering Robin Hood Hills or going down Cat Street towards the bayou, which means that the killer, or killers, would have had to enter the wood with them, take them elsewhere, and then take the kids back to the woods after killing them. It would be completely nonsensical, and the boys being murdered where they were found is the only logical explanation. However, like everything else in this case, there are some oddities. Oddities like the discovery of clothing not matching what the victims were wearing, a lack of mosquito bites on the victims' bodies, and the missing underwear do leave lingering questions. Regarding the mosquito bites, or lack thereof, Robin Hood Hills was well known to locals as being thick with mosquitoes during the spring and summer months, particularly in the evening hours. Many locals have openly admitted that the mosquitoes in the woods were in such numbers that it would be almost impossible to stay in the woods for more than a few minutes after around 8 p.m. in the evening. West Memphis police officer Regina Meek said that she went to the woods that night and breathed in a swarm of mosquitoes so thick that she could barely breathe. Worth considering is that the side of the woods through the meadow to the east was also transversable by car. The prosecution alleged that the area was cleaned of the blood, which explained the lack of it. It is also true that mosquito bites take time to develop and may not be visible on a dead body if the inflammation process does not have the time to develop before rigor mortis begins. Rigor mortis on average takes around 2 hours to develop, just throwing that little factoid in there. The manhole theory. There were several manholes around the area of Robin Hood Hills, and there's absolutely no blood at the crime scene. So amateur internet researchers have speculated that perhaps the boys had been killed in one of the manholes and transported to the ditch nearby to stage the scene. There is some solid reasoning to this theory, I suppose. No one was seen at the crime scene, despite there being intense searching through most of the evening hours. There were bruises on the boys' bodies that looked like they may have been caused by the rebar rungs of a manhole. The perpetrator could have murdered the boys there, drowned them, waited for the searching to subside later in the evening, and then transported the bodies and removed them onto the crime scene. For me, it's key to remember Occam's razor in this instance. And with this, here are some problems with this theory in my opinion. Number 1, the perpetrator would have to remove each boy one by one, risking being seen that night, and also, it would have been no quick process. Number 2, there are no significant injuries to the shoulders or arms of the boys to suggest that they had not been carried any distance. 3. One of the main manholes in the area was extremely dark and deep. It was actually investigated at the time. This means that the killer would have needed a light and would have had a hard time carrying the boys out of there, also increasing the likelihood of injuring the boys' bodies or leaving evidence upon them. Number 4, and my final point, there's the then obvious question of why the killer wouldn't just leave the bodies in the manhole instead of transporting them to a drainage ditch. Unless of course they wanted the bodies to be found. But if that was the case though, there are far, far better places that the bodies could have been left to guarantee them being found. Also, by placing the bodies in water means that they would decompose much faster, again reducing the chances of them being found quickly. Why would the killer choose the ditch and not the deeper bayou, unless it was a crime in the moment? The investigation. This case was quite possibly the most extensive investigation the West Memphis Police Department had ever undertaken. Now I'm careful to say extensive here and not intensive, as whilst the investigation was massive and took a lot of manpower, it was also sloppy and corners were cut and decisions were made that were very questionable, to say the least. Some key figures, like Sergeant Mike Allen, would admit much later that he had no official training in homicide investigation when the bodies were pulled from the water, though he did expand on that to say that he had handled some lesser murder investigations prior to 1993. Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell, who was the head of the investigation, admitted that there was so much information coming into the police department that they could barely keep track of it all. How exactly the investigation was handled is one of the most controversial aspects of this case. One of. Christopher Byers was reported missing at 8:10 p.m. on May 5th. Michael Moore was reported at 9:24 p.m. on May 5th, and Stevie Branch's absence was called in by his mother after she finished work at around 9:25 p.m. on May 5th. 2 police officers initially looked for the missing children during their late shift on May 5th, and the boys' families searched throughout the night. The full search and rescue team only began in earnest on the morning of May 6th. The officers claimed that there was a mix-up in reporting, so the search and rescue was not aware of the boys' disappearance until the next day, or the morning of May 6th. Although this is likely not accurate, as West Memphis police have also stated on a number of occasions that a person must be missing for 24 hours before they will begin a formal investigation. Despite Officer Ridge claiming at the trial that he had ridden around the Robin Hood Hills woods in the morning of May 6th on a 3-wheeler, the bodies would only be discovered in the afternoon. Although, given how the boys' bodies were submerged in water when they were found, it's possible that Officer Ridge just didn't see the bodies when or if he passed them. There are also varying accounts and records of how exactly the bodies were found and who specifically found them. Chief Inspector Gitchell claimed that on May 7th an officer saw a shoe floating in the water the day before. Juvenile parole officer Steve Jones later said that it was him who saw the debris floating in the ditch, but that it was a cap and not a shoe. Jones radioed the police dispatch at 1:14 p.m. and was met by Sergeant Mike Allen and the head of search and rescue, Denver Reed. Reed, for reasons unknown, left the scene shortly afterwards. Allen either fell, slipped, or intentionally entered the water and then accidentally dislodged the body of Michael Moore with his foot while he was wading through the water. This occurred at 1:45 p.m. The children were removed from the water before the coroner arrived at 3:55 p.m. and clothing was piled next to the river. There are two crucial pictures of Mike Allen at the crime scene that were shown specifically at the second trial, the Eccles-Baldwin trial to be specific. I'll go into it in more detail later, but just to clarify, Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were tried separately from Jesse Miskelly, with Miskelly's trial being the first to take place. One of the photographs of Allen depicts when he was about to fall or enter the water, near when he saw the article of clothing floating, and the other photograph shows him in the water immediately after. Allen is clearly wearing two different watches, one black and one white in the photographs, but they were supposedly taken in quick succession right after one another. The defense would question Allen repeatedly about why the photographs were taken if he fell in the river accidentally. In the Eccles-Baldwin trial, Allen alleged that it was taken as a joke since he was about to tumble into the water. Because all police officers joke around while investigating the murder of 3 children, I guess. Here's a transcript of the trial exchange between Paul Ford, an attorney for Jason Baldwin, and Sergeant Mike Allen.
Paul Ford, when you and Officer Hester were walking into the woods, were y'all just clicking photographs one right after the other, trying to catch each and everything that y'all did? So she just happened to catch you leaning across the ditch, just happened to catch you falling in the ditch, just by luck, when nobody even knew that you were going to find anything. Nothing significant had occurred, but y'all just happened to be taking photographs. Is that correct? Mike Allen. Diane Hester, at that point was before we realized that we had a tragedy of this nature. And at that time, I think she took those photographs because she was poking fun at me because I was fixing to fall, in the water. Ford. Okay. Allen. Ford. So these two pictures were taken as a joke, State's Exhibit number 10 and State's Exhibit number 11.
Sergeant Allen also said that the reason for the different watches in each photograph was due to a product of reflection from the sun. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt on this one. The defense alleged that the West Memphis Police Department had staged these photographs, though why they would do that was never really clarified. To elaborate on my earlier comment about door-to-door questioning of the neighborhood by police, exactly 526 homes were canvassed in the following days, from a total of around 800 in the immediate area. Of those 526 homes, 124 had no recorded answer, 242 had no information to give officers, 68 had only brief answers, 17 had long detailed answers, and 60 filled out a police-prepared questionnaire. The neighborhoods of the victims were not really canvassed. None of Stevie Branch's immediate neighbors were interviewed, and the police obtained barely anything other from brief conversations from the next-door neighbors of Christopher Byers and Michael Moore. This is with the exception of John Mark Byers, who volunteered to give a lengthy statement. John Mark Byers would become known in this case as someone who was partial to grandstanding and attention-seeking, so this wasn't out of character for him. The families of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael were also not investigated. Melissa Byers gave a short, modest interview, again out of choice. In the days following the murders, Pam Hobbs and Dana Moore did not give substantial interviews besides a brief conversation with law enforcement on May 10th. The first time that Pam Hobbs gave a lengthy interview was in 2007, 14 years after the murders. None of the family members were considered suspects in the boys' murders, nor looked at with any suspicion. The only information that Todd Moore shared with the West Memphis police was the colour of his son's wallet. To be clear, Todd Moore did have an alibi for the day of the murders, and the following day. He was a truck driver and was out of state at the time. Terry Hobbs was not interviewed at all until 2007. Additionally, Terry Hobbs' home was the only house that was not searched for samples to compare fibres found at the crime scene. The houses of Christopher Byers and Michael Moore were searched and had several clothing articles seized by police for elimination purposes. The police had an inconsistent approach to investigating details about the children's lives. They did look into several suspects that the Byers family had named. The Moores and the Hobbs families never provided a list of people they thought were suspicious to the police, however. The police also dropped the ball on others. Melissa Byers mentioned a boy named George that played with Christopher in Robin Hood Hills, who she never met or learned anything about. Police never looked at this, even though Melissa provided the following details. Quote, Christopher, in the last 3 months, would be gone for like 2 hours or more, and we would be worried about him. When he would come home, his shoes and socks would be muddy. Melissa Byers stated that she suspected that Christopher had been to the Robin Hood Hills area, even though he was not allowed to play there. When Melissa would ask Christopher where he had been, he would tell her that he had been playing with George. Melissa said she never found out who George was, and Christopher would never admit to being at Robin Hood Hills. Terry Hobbs, in 2007, would also mention a friend of his son's named George, though he did not know the kid's last name or where he lived. Furthermore, there is no record of an interview with anybody named George on Callahan. Now, Callahan, just to be clear, is the most in-depth and detailed research archive in relation to the West Memphis 3 case. It holds, amongst other things, thousands of documents from the police files, complete transcripts of the 2 trial court proceedings, and links to hundreds of newspaper articles. It's a fantastic research tool, and no, I'm not affiliated with it in any way. Now, that being said, I've done some extra digging, and it seems that George is believed to be a George Taylor, who is the same age as the 3 boys. Taylor made a comment on a West Memphis 3 Facebook group in 2018, and said that he was with the boys on the day that they disappeared. That day, he said, he was wearing green shorts. This coincides with some eyewitnesses who said they had seen Stevie, Michael and Christopher on May 5th and that one of them was wearing green shorts. Now, we know that none of the boys were wearing shorts that day, so this poses questions about the reliability of some of the witness accounts. In 2018, when George Taylor made these comments on Facebook, it opened up answers as well as further questions. But in support of Taylor's comments, Pam Hobbs came forward and confirmed that she knew George Taylor and he was in fact a friend of her son's, along with Christopher and Michael too. She also produced photographs of her son Stevie and George playing together at the time. When John Mark Byers was asked if he thought there was anyone suspicious in his child's life, he answered that there was a kid named TJ who was about 16 and seemed very interested in Christopher. A TJ was never interviewed. Side note, while researching this case, my team actually found TJ was quite active on a West Memphis 3 internet message board. He commented that John Mark Byers had totally misrepresented the situation between him and Christopher. He was also happy to share some rather graphic stories about John Mark Byers abusing his own children. We'll come back to that in more detail later. In all actuality, there were only a few interviews with any of the children's friends. Authority figures in the boys' lives, like one of the boys' teachers, the janitor at their school, and the boys' Cub Scout leader, were interviewed but did not make up much of a portion in the police department's suspect pool. In fact, the boy's Cub Scout leader had a very odd inconsistency in his only interview with the police that was not followed up on at all. I swear it's difficult to tell if certain omissions in this case were a result of inexperience and or incompetence, or deliberate and just suspect oversight. According to some sources, namely independent long-term investigators, Dana Moore has stated that she did in fact give a statement to the West Memphis police, although there is no record found on Callahan to support this. Perhaps the police lost it or mishandled it. Again, I'm given some benefit of the doubt here, as the police department in the small town of West Memphis were not experienced in dealing with a case of this magnitude. I'm not excusing it if that's what happened. I'm just trying to apply some logic here. Or perhaps they didn't want to believe that parents or quote-unquote normal people could be involved in this sort of crime. Perhaps the motives of the police department were more sinister too. I'm ruling nothing out at this point, and I'm just spitballing. The police did go through a number of suspects in the early stages of the investigation. I won't list them all here, but if you pick up a copy of the book Abomination by William Ramsey, it does a good job of listing everyone who the police had on their radar early on in the case. The pool was narrowed down pretty quickly though, and with some very questionable methods. I'll talk about this in a short while. The police, however, essentially looked at three types of suspects. Number 1, transients passing through the area. Number 2, teenagers believed to be involved in cult activity. And number 3, child molesters and previous sex offenders. The great bulk of testimony and statements appeared to be taken from the youth of West Memphis, and a profile put forth by an investigator in the early days of the murder. He stated that the murderer was probably in their late teens or early 20s. It's unclear what this investigator based this upon. FYI, I'm not a policeman, but even I am aware that roughly 65% of all murders in the United States are committed by someone known to the deceased. This stat has been a consistent average in the United States for over 70 years, and it should be known to all police officers and investigators. It's why in a murder case, most police will always look at family and friends as suspects first and eliminate them before looking at anyone else. But that didn't happen in this case for some reason. This data is from the US Justice Department, just to be entirely clear. Anyway, one thing I noticed when reading the police documents in this case is that the investigators frequently excluded people because their fingerprints did not match those found at the crime scene, such as Jason Howard Baldwin, not to be confused with Charles Jason Baldwin, who would be convicted, and William V. At trial, the West Memphis police said that there was not any comparable fingerprints recovered from the crime scene. So, how exactly these people were ruled out is not entirely clear. Certainly having fingerprints not match those found at the crime scene did not exclude the convicted on trial, for example. Side note, the West Memphis Police Department allegedly refused help from the Arkansas State Police in investigating these murders. This is detailed in a number of books and online research forums and archives, but I haven't been able to find an official document to evidence this. Although there might not be one, so I'm just saying this is alleged by a number of sources at the time. Polygraph tests. The use of polygraphs in helping the West Memphis police investigate this case was pretty extensive in determining the suspect pool early on in the investigation. Now, the accuracy of polygraph tests are the same as a deck of tarot cards. Like, actually. So it always surprises me how American law enforcement utilize polygraphs in their investigations, even though they are inadmissible in court. Now, the polygraph was invented in 1921 by medical student John Larson. Larson himself officially stated that the polygraph doesn't work, and it was a pseudo-scientific device. He felt it necessary to make this statement after he saw the increase of its use by law enforcement in the United States. Unfortunately, it was too late. A polygraph measures your heart rate, breathing, and galvanic skin response. but there is no evidence at all that any pattern of physiological responses is unique to deception. Simply put, there is simply no common or consistent reaction in a human heart rate, breathing, or galvanic skin response that occurs when a lie is being told. Police investigators will often say that they know it doesn't work. However, it's a good measure to trick gullible criminals into giving a confession. Although that response in itself is absurd, because the same reaction can occur in innocent individuals if they are nervous or believe that the test to be accurate. Fun fact, in the 1960s, CIA interrogation expert Cleve Baxter conducted a series of experiments on plants with a polygraph machine. Baxter was certain that plants could communicate with each other, with animals, and with humans through ESP, or extrasensory perception powers. Telepathy, basically. His experiment didn't evidence that plants were communicating with us, unfortunately, but what it did prove was when plants were hooked up to a polygraph machine and asked a series of questions, that their polygraph score and outcome was exactly the same as a human put in the same situation and asked the same questions. The plants and humans were both 80% truthful, apparently. Baxter published his findings in 1968. If you were ever asked to take a polygraph test by police, refuse. They will likely say this makes you look guilty. But my suggestion would be to state that given the lack of accuracy of the test, you are more concerned that if you take the test it will incorrectly implicate you in a crime that you did not commit, and thus falsely lead the investigation in the wrong direction. Encourage them to conduct a proper investigation and obtain proper evidence in the case. Anyway, I digress. It's telling that the judge at Jesse Miskelly's trial refused to let his polygraph test be allowed as evidence. People in the case that were almost certainly lying passed the test too, and other results were interpreted differently depending on who looked at them. Suspects like child molester Louis Larry B were frequently let go after completing a polygraph, and their alibis were actually not investigated any further. The main individuals who failed a polygraph in the investigation were Damien Eccles on May 10th, James Kenny Martin, who failed on just 2 questions, L.G. Hollingsworth, who would fail on just 1 question, Richard S., who backed up his friend L.G. Hollingsworth's alibi, though later recanted, Buddy Lucas, who failed 3 questions when he claimed that Jesse had not actually confessed to him, and finally Jesse Miskelly prior to his confession. Jason Baldwin intelligently refused to submit to a polygraph test. Even the way that the West Memphis police used the damn polygraph test came into question when an expert testified in pre-trial hearings they had not been conducting the polygraph tests correctly, especially in the case of Jesse Miskelly. The expert examined the results himself and claimed that Jesse was not lying in any question except when asked about taking drugs. The prosecution pointed out, however, that the expert commenting was not there in person and that the person who did administer the test was well practiced in their execution. I'll leave that up to your thoughts and opinions. I think this is a good place to end this episode. We'll pick things right back up in episode 2. Until then, good night everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.